Bronze whalers are a really well-known shark. Most people, if they're walking up and down the beach, driving up and down the beach, if you see a shark in the shallow water, it's probably going to be a bronze whaler. Most of them are fairly small, but they actually can get up to nearly 300 kilos, which is a big shark when fully grown. The reason you see them so close to shore is that they love to eat schools of small fish, salmon and mullet especially, and those animals tend to be close to the shore. They do live for a fairly long time. Bronze whalers are reasonably long-lived fish, and they don't actually have the ability to breed before about between 4 and 20 years of age. So depending on the individual and where they're living, they do need to be quite old before they can have pups. Interesting as well, the young of a shark are called pups, just like a dog. So very interesting shark indeed. Bit of dimorphism in the bronze whaler. So if you see a bronze whaler with a big toothy grin, the top teeth of a male bronze whaler are both longer and more heavily curved than those of a female. So big buck teeth grin, usually going to be a male.
We've already seen some of these here today, and that's the crested tern, or the greater crested tern. Quite a distinctive beak, which is yellow, so that's one way of identifying it. When it's breeding, it has a funky hairdo that is very dark black. So not always that noticeable when they're not breeding, but still has that sticky up hair on the top of its head. And they like the sheltered bays where they dive down and catch fish. They do breed on offshore islands and stacks just on the ground, often in large colonies. So you'll see lots of terns over here.
A lot of people in South Australia especially probably don't need much of an introduction to the King George whiting. They're the largest of the whitings and a really distinctive animal with a beautiful brown spotty pattern across the top of their body and gold coating of scales underneath. Probably the most sought after table fish here in South Australia, and their price at market reflects that. But once again, because they are so expensive and they're worth so much as a commercial fishery, recreational and commercial fishers target them quite heavily. That's a good thing if you like to eat them, but they are really long-lived fish. And again, they can't breed before about 4 or 5 years of age. So when we're fishing for them, we need to make sure that we're limiting the amount we take. You know, take what you can eat, put back what you can't. A beautiful fish, a bottom feeder, which is maybe a little bit unusual to say for such a delicate table fish. They do eat all sorts of different crustaceans and all sorts of different things. And here on the island, they can live for over 20 years. So they do have quite a long life and generally are more slow growing than those on the mainland, but can still get to up to about 70 centimetres in length if you find a big old one.
One of our North Coast's most recognisable birds has to be the Australian pelican. Our Australian pelicans are actually one of the most graceful birds in the sky. To see them just soaring around for such a, let's face it, a little bit clumsy bird on the land. They do some spectacular manoeuvres in the sky, not so spectacular when they land on the water, but they also make beautiful V shapes when they're flying in formation. And sometimes they're flying, you know, right up to the centre of Australia, up to Lake Eyre and other basins for breeding and feeding events. One of the things that they do well is fish as a team. So they'll actually herd fish as they're swimming around in the sheltered bays and then take turns in diving in and capitalising. A big threat from entanglement from fishing gear, particularly from being fed, but also they know that they can get a cheap meal at the end of a line, and so there's a really big problem with hooks and sinkers and entanglement with Australian pelicans. So we don't really need to feed wildlife, they can feed themselves.
Flathead. The main species we see here in the bay is a long-headed flathead, but we actually get about 3 or 4 different species of flathead around the island. They're a bottom living fish and a voracious predator. Often you won't even know they're there until they come screaming up out of the sand. Big mouth, engulf their food and usually will eat it whole. They will eat almost anything they can swallow, so they're a fantastic predator. If you're a fisherman, you've probably encountered this problem at some point in your time. They do have really sharp spines on their operculum, their gill cover, and those spines will inflict a pretty nasty wound on skin. If you do get wounded, it's really painful, but there's an old fisherman's tale out there. I haven't tried it myself, but I'm told it works. you can rub that wound on the belly of the fish, on the slime on the belly of the fish, and it should help ease the pain, which is a pretty incredible thing.
The common sandpiper is one of the amazing migratory shorebirds that only comes to Kangaroo Island when it's not breeding. So they breed actually up in Asia and Europe and fly all the way down here via flight paths to come to Kangaroo Island to fatten up before they actually return back to their breeding grounds. So it's really important that the penguins pipe down. It's really important that these birds are able to be undisturbed as they feed along the shoreline, because if they don't fatten up, they actually won't make it home to their breeding grounds. The second bird that we have that's migratory is one that actually breeds in the Arctic tundra, and that's the ruddy turnstone. A beautiful little bird with very, very colourful brown patterned feathers, which are visible when it's in flight. And they're called a turnstone because they actually turn over rocks on reefs and rocks on rocky beaches and packs of seaweed, trying to find, all the little mollusks and worms and things that are underneath that it eats. So again, it's just a visitor here, but it's really important that it's able to feed and fatten up, because it's around about 18,000 kilometres that it has to fly back to the Arctic tundra.
Spiny gurnard is another one that I see here in the bay quite often, really common bycatch for people that are fishing on the bottom. The fish itself is actually not called a spiny gurnard. The one that we get here is called a Gulf gurnard perch. They do get quite large, up to about 30 or 40 centimetres in length, and they're a venomous scorpion fish. So scorpion fishes generally live on the bottom, large flat pectoral fins, and most of them are venomous. So if you have a spiny gurnard on your hook, try and deal with it with a set of long pliers, or avoid bringing it on board the boat. If you do get stung by them though, there's a fairly simple treatment for that sting. The dorsal spines on their back are how they deliver their venom. But if you are stung, all you need to do is find the hottest water you can possibly tolerate, immerse that wound in the water, and it will actually denature or destroy the proteins in that venom, and it will stop it from hurting, which is a pretty handy thing. If you're in the middle of the sea, got a kettle or a thermos full of hot water, you can save your trip, which is good.
There's a couple of cormorants that call Kangaroo Island home, but in this part of Kangaroo Island, you're most likely to see along our coastlines the Australian pied cormorant. There is another one that's a little pied cormorant, but that's more likely to be seen on inland dams and rivers. The pied cormorant is a very strong underwater swimmer, so it dives down and uses its powerful legs to propel itself through the water after fish, and then when it's finished feeding, it'll go and roost somewhere on a jetty or a pole, and it'll hang its wings out to dry. One way to distinguish it between the little pied cormorant is the fact that it actually has full trousers, so it's got a black thigh all the way up its thigh from its legs, whereas the little pied cormorant has only got a little pair of shorts.
Blue-throated wrasse, they're a fantastic species as well, and another one that here in Emu Bay, where we've got an assortment of sandy bottom and rocky bottom, is quite common. Like a lot of wrasses, you'll see them in big numbers, and they can be a bit of a nuisance if you're targeting other fish. They are edible if they're prepared in the right way, but most people like to put them back. Interesting thing about blue-throated wrasse, they are a large fish, but all of them start life as females. So up to about 4 or 5 years old, every blue-throated wrasse you're going to see is a female, and the females are distinguished by a sort of olive drab colour with some light markings on their body. At about 4 or 5 years of age, they'll start to transition into males, and then they'll start to take on that typical colour, big, round, bulbous face, nice long teeth, and that beautiful blue throat patch that they've got there. Once there's a big boy in an area, they'll have a harem of females. So they could have dozens of females in an area with just the one boy. The blue devil is one that is quite dear to me. I love seeing them. I'm obviously an avid scuba diver and snorkeler, and they inhabit rocky reefs down to quite deep depths. They're very territorial and very long-lived fish. Beautiful to see if you've ever kept a betta or a Siamese fighting fish. They're basically a giant version of that. From the family Plesiops, and there's about a dozen different species in that family, of which the blue devil is one of the largest. There is some suggestion they can live for 30 to 40 years, so fairly long-lived fish, and the spots that give them their name, black background with beautiful electric blue spots, are like a fingerprint, like your and I's fingerprint. And if you get a good enough photo of a blue devil in the wild, those spots can actually be used to identify individual fish. So along the Adelaide coastline, where we also find the blue devil, there are certain fish that are really well known to the scuba diving community in different places, and we can ID those fish by those fingerprint-like spots on their gill covers, which is a really, really cool thing.
One of my favourite little birds is the hooded plover, which is a specialist beach nesting bird. And you know, it doesn't make a stick nest, it makes a tiny little shallow scrape that you can hardly see in the sand, and it lays its eggs there, unfortunately, between about August and May, which is also our peak visitor time. So the eggs are actually really camouflaged on a scrape in the sand, and unlike some of our other plovers, which are really lapwings, these guys are passive nest defenders. So aggressive nest defenders will swoop and squawk and make a big deal to keep you away from their ground nest. But passive nest defenders, they just want to get you to chase them and lead you away from their nest. So if you see little birds running along the beach, maybe they'll have a broken wing. They're probably trying to get you away from their nest. Now, when these little eggs, if they're lucky enough to hatch, the chicks actually have to get themselves down to the shore and feed themselves from the day that they're born. So it's really important that they can access the beach, either the seaweed or along estuaries, so that they can find those tiny invertebrates that they need to survive. So if they're constantly being disturbed by people or cars or dogs off lead, the parents are calling to them and they're just going to drop down and hide. Might be behind seaweed, might be behind a little coastal plant, or it might be in a tyre rut along the beach. And that's where there's a big problem of these birds being crushed on beaches. But also, you know, if you're walking on a beach, try and stay below the high water mark on the wet sand if it's safe to do so. Keep your dog on a lead in breeding season, and if you do need to drive on the beach again, just try and stay on the wet sand.
Magpie perch, named for good reason, beautiful black and white bars along their body. They've usually got a pink, orange or red tail, wrist and dorsal tail, so pretty easy to identify. They're an omnivorous fish, so magpie perch will eat anything from worms and snails they find in the sand, right through small fish, crustaceans and even some algae, so they do like to eat anything that they can. Really cool thing that magpie perch can do, which not a lot of fish can, is that they actually have control over the central colour bar of their body. So when we look at the fish, they've got a black bar on their head, a white bar just behind their gills and then another black bar before the rest of their body. That centre black bar can turn on and off, almost like a light switch. It's quite an incredible thing, and we think it's used to confuse predators. Not something that many fish are capable of doing is adjusting their colour in such a rapid way like a magpie perch can. So you'll see them around, living especially around seagrass beds and algae. Really common fish to see, but a little bit more than meets the eye. Really frequent residents of Emu Bay as well. We do get a couple of species of dolphin, but the bottlenose is going to be the one you see closest to shore most of the time. Beautiful light grey dolphin, a fairly large animal and often seen in pods. Some of the pods I've seen around Emu Bay, 20 to 30, or even bigger as you go offshore. Really clever animals. Being a marine mammal, they use all sorts of different tactics to try and catch their food. They're well known for actually doing things for enjoyment, which is not something that a lot of animals in the world we know do for sure. But one of the interesting things about dolphins is a lot of their communication is done through sound, through echolocation and through similar tactics. They make those noises using a similar mechanism to how a human being would, as well as air bubbles and other things, and they receive them back into their body through something called their melon. In a dolphin's head, there's a big bulbous part at the top of their skull, which is filled with a sort of jelly-like fluid. And as those sounds hit that, it sends signals to their brain and deciphers what those signals are. So if you're ever wondering why a dolphin's got a big bulbous head, it is actually called his melon. And that's how they receive that sound, that high-pitched sound that they make to communicate.